Less than a month after starting a war with Iran that people don't really understand, and just over 2 months since toppling Venezuela's leader, President Trump is signaling another country that's ripe for U.S. intervention, Cuba. As you know, it's an island of 11 million people. It's 90 miles off the coast of Florida. The U.S. has maintained a strict trade embargo on Cuba more or less for the last 65 years, ever since Fidel Castro declared his country a communist state. Under the Obama administration, U.S.-Cuba relations softened a little bit, but Donald Trump has taken a much harder line. In January, the Trump administration imposed a blockade of Cuba to keep other countries from supplying it with oil, which has resulted in sweeping blackouts in what may be the worst electricity crisis in the country's modern history. Yesterday, the island's power grid collapsed for the third time this month. Listen to what the president said, the American president says he's got in mind for Cuba.
I do believe I'll be having the honor of taking Cuba. That'd be good. That's a big honor.
Taking Cuba.
Taking Cuba in some form, yeah. Taking Cuba. I mean, whether I free it, take it, I think I could do anything I want with it. You want to know the truth?
On Thursday, General Francis Donovan, the head of U.S. Southern Command, said the military is not preparing to invade Cuba. But Secretary of State Marco Rubio, whose parents immigrated to the U.S. from Cuba, is a longtime proponent of regime change in Havana. For him, one U.S. official told the New York Times, it all goes back to Cuba, anything he can do to weaken the regime in Cuba. Last week, the Trump administration told Cuba that its president, Miguel Diaz-Canel, must step down in order for negotiations with the United States to progress. Cuban officials say that is out of the question. And as Trump increases his threats against Cuba, millions of Cubans are suffering from a growing humanitarian crisis. According to the New York Times, quote, trash is piling up as garbage trucks are idled due to a lack of fuel. Without refrigeration, meat and dairy in homes and food markets are spoiling. Because Havana's water system depends on electric pumps, running water has been cut off for many residents. Public health officials have postponed tens of thousands of surgeries, and cancer patients undergoing chemotherapy have seen their treatments disrupted by power outages and a lack of refrigerated medicine, end quote. All right, so I've got the perfect person to talk to this about, my longtime friend and the longtime journalist, David Ariosto. He's the author of This is Cuba, an American journalist under Castro's shadow. David, nice to see you, my friend. Thank you for being with us. And I want to talk to you about another matter in a moment. But you spent 2 years living in Cuba as a reporter. What are you hearing about the situation now and how dire it is inside Cuba?
You know, I was talking to some people last night. It's good to see you again, Ali, as well. But I was talking to some people last night in Havana, and they just mirrored exactly what you said. I mean, it's a situation that, you know, affects hospitals, affects schools, affects transport, people taking bicycles to work every day. You know, this is something that Cubans experienced during the 1990s with the fall of the Soviet Union and the lack of subsidies that came out of that country that sort of propped up Cuba for decades. Had a similar situation with Venezuela, and obviously when those subsidies went away and a clamp down in terms of fuel that we've seen in recent months, that all kind of wreaks havoc on the system. It's also just an aging infrastructure there. I mean, I remember living there myself and experiencing some of those blackouts, especially during the summer months. It could be quite uncomfortable. But beyond that, energy is just a lifeblood for every aspect of the economy. So hospitals, schools, transport, you know, all of this kind of comes to a bit of a grinding halt. And the victims here, unfortunately, are sort of the rank and file.
I want to spell that out because you've been in Venezuela. You've seen what happens in these countries where people are the victims of this. In your book, you write about the 1990s. You say that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Cuba's sugar and fuel subsidies had all but dried up. Capital vanished from the island and access to food waned, with many Cubans surviving on a diet of sugar water and rice. As the United States tightened the embargo screws, the average Cuban shed up to 25% of their body weight, leaving the country on the brink of famine. Trying to get a sense of, are things similar or substantially worse today than they were in the period about which you were writing in Cuba?
You know, it's hard to tell in terms of the nature of being here. So, you know, I'd hesitate to make too many comparisons, but at the same time, what happened in the early 1990s was a prolonged period of several years and sort of a manifestation of the Cuban government just scrambling to figure out how to drum up capital in the absence of those Soviet subsidies. What they did was they unlocked a lot of sort of micro enterprise, and you started to see like little restaurants and little shops kind of spring up across the country. That same thing happened in sort of the post-Venezuela environment and before, Raul Castro, when he was in place, was trying to kind of drum up some investment. And in fact, part of what the Obama administration did and what the Biden administration did in subsequent years was try to establish a little bit more of those banking ties and those sort of direct exchanges in business. And what's interesting about this is that the Cuban government itself has been the one that's sort of been dragging their feet in terms of this broad opening, because I think there's this sense that even though these fuel subsidies have been wildly damaging, and the commentary that comes from Donald Trump is reminiscent of a time that was, more than a century past, during the Spanish-American War, when the so-called Platt Amendment came about and Cuba effectively became a client state of the United States, which was the fertile ground of which Fidel Castro came to power. There is also this sense that too much opening to a mercantile system can expose the Castro government and kind of weaken the tendrils of power that they've had for years. And so there's been a dragging of their feet for several years now in terms of a broader opening, because when you marry political systems that are at odds with the mercantile systems, you just don't know what will come of that. And maintaining control has been sort of a core part of this government. It's emblematic of the fact that Raul's grandson is having direct talks with Marco Rubio, in the sense that Castro's still kind of pulling the strings behind the scenes in Cuba.
But you're right. The Cubans are suggesting, and as recently as on Meet the Press just a little while ago, that they are open to conversations with the United States.